At 3:30, Real Histories. Jerry Northam explores the story of a serial killer and a miscarriage of justice that marked the beginning of the end for capital punishment in Britain.
In December 1938, John Christie and his wife Ethel came to live here in the Ladbroke Grove district of West London. In the years that followed, John Reginald Halliday Christie would murder 8 people in his house, including his own wife. Their address was 10 Rillington Place. Today, Rillington Place is nowhere to be found. The original houses and street were demolished in the late 70s, and now the closest approximation to Rillington Place is here on Bartle Road, hemmed in by the Ladbroke Grove railway line and the A40 Westway roaring overhead. But the original address, though gone, remains notorious, both for the horrific crimes committed here and for the execution of an apparently innocent man, Timothy Evans. The story of John Christie and Timothy Evans was told in print by the writer and broadcaster Ludovic Kennedy. He describes how Christie murdered Timothy Evans' wife and baby daughter, then pointed the finger of blame at Evans himself, who was duly hanged for murder. Ludovic Kennedy argues throughout that Timothy Evans was innocent of murder, and his book was turned into a film, 10 Rillington Place, released in 1970, with Richard Attenborough playing John Christie and John Hurt taking the part of Timothy Evans. When the film was made on location, Rillington Place had already been renamed Ruston Close, and the residents had very mixed feelings about the arrival of the film crew.
They changed the name to Ruston Close, but to me it'll always be Rillington Place.
If they want to make a film down here, they've got every right in the world. I think people should know about what happened here years ago, like, you know. Well, it's something that could have in history, you know.
I knew Christie, kind of a meek man. I found him very respectful toward the female sex, and he'd always tip his hat when he'd come across anyone.
This actor certainly looks like Mr. Christie. He's so very smoky.
You take off it. You're not supposed to come here. Switch it off.
English justice, which is supposed to be the finest system of justice in the world, made a cock-up. It hanged the wrong man.
At his Oxfordshire home, now Sir Ludovic Kennedy explained how and why he took up the case of Timothy Evans.
I was doing a certain amount of reviewing at that time for a magazine called Truth, and one of the books that was sent to me to review was called The Man on Your Conscience by a London solicitor called Michael Eddowes, and it wasn't very long, it was about 100 pages, but when I'd read it 3 times, I was satisfied that this man was trying to show that Timothy John Evans had been hanged for a murder which had not been committed by him, but by his fellow lodger, John Reginald Halliday Christie. And that's what set me off on the whole thing.
At the time, we hadn't heard about miscarriages of justice. You presumably hadn't heard about miscarriages of justice.
No,
so did it seem to you credible that the wrong man had been hanged?
Well, it was quite a shock to have to admit it to myself, quite apart from convincing other people. But that's how it turned out. And as a writer, one is always after the truth. And the truth, as I saw it, was that this is what had happened. There had been a very grave miscarriage of justice.
Once Christie had been caught and convicted, there must at least have been a very substantial doubt about the conviction of Timothy Evans, and yet it was more than a further decade before he was finally pardoned. Why did it take so long?
Oh, because the government, whatever government happened to be in power, is always very reluctant that it's made a cock-up. And time after time there were excuses made why this couldn't be looked into again.
It was obvious to anybody except the willfully blind and the legal profession that we made a mistake. And therefore, if you make that kind of mistake, it is, to my mind, far more important that you set it right so that people can believe not in the infallibility of justice, but in its integrity.
You talk in your book about people who are more concerned about the infallibility of the justice system than its integrity. What did you mean by that?
If you're of the mind that the criminal law as it stands, or as it stood then, was okay, then you subscribed to what is believed by a huge number of people, but isn't necessarily true. And that was the trouble with this case. It took ages and ages for it to be recognized that Evans was innocent.
Richard Attenborough took on the role of John Christie in a career-defining performance, and the film was made mainly in the original location. His intention was to show that the death penalty, abolished for an experimental period in 1965, should never be reintroduced. At his London home, Lord Attenborough explained to me how he approached the characterization of a mass murderer.
I didn't talk to anybody. Makeup took a long time, 2 or 3 hours each day, and I would stop meeting people and talking to them, and I went straight to my room and then onto the set, and I didn't see anybody at lunchtime, and after the work was over, taking off the makeup and so on and releasing my hair, as it were, which was considerably more than it is now. I had to cleanse myself in a way, and it sounds very dramatic and perhaps exaggerated, but it wasn't. I really did feel conscious of the emotions that I had had to dredge up, which should not and could not and weren't, of course, any part of my normal personality. And it was an exercise that I've never had to quite go through before. Pinky was one, Pinky Brown in Brighton Rock was one thing. This was fact and actuality, not born of the genius of a writer, but documentary in its style almost.
Did the film have the impact you planned?
I believe so. It, in the main, got very laudatory reviews and was only, of course, attacked by those who fundamentally disagreed with its conviction.
And hanging didn't come back? We didn't?
No, we didn't. No, we didn't. Thank God.
Were you completely convinced that Timothy Evans was not guilty?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, unequivocally. Oh, I was, and I think Nudo was. Oh, yes, I think so.
In 1948, Timothy Evans, his wife Beryl, and their baby daughter Geraldine moved into the top floor flat of 10 Rillington Place. By that time, John Christie had already strangled 2 women, and their bodies were buried in his back garden. A year later, when Beryl Evans found she was pregnant again, she decided to have an abortion. It's now generally accepted that Christie convinced her he had medical expertise and offered to perform the abortion, then gassed and strangled her, later strangling 1-year-old Geraldine with a tie. Timothy Evans was tried and hanged for murder on March the 9th, 1950, and Christie went on killing. By the time his victims were discovered by a new tenant at 10 Rillington Place 3 years later, Christie was homeless and destitute, walking the streets of London. At the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television in Bradford, Head of Collections Paul Goodman took me through the news coverage of the hunt for Christie.
This is a wonderfully evocative picture of 10 Rillington Place. And this is actually a scene of the police shortly after the discovery of the bodies, standing outside what is clearly a very run-down and dilapidated property.
A couple of bobbies in their coats.
Yeah. I mean, again,
son standing at the front door.
I mean, I don't know whether it was a deliberate of the press to choose to photograph the house on this particular day, but quite clearly we can see that it's been raining, and you know, it kind of adds to the overall ambience of the photograph.
John Christie is here. He is.
Yeah.
On the pier at Brighton.
Yeah.
Looking like a bank clerk. Tall, elegant, bald, and rather dull. Nondescript, even.
Relatively nondescript, and that was a big problem with this case because he was mild-mannered, or came across, he appeared to be mild-mannered. Not somebody who would conform with the kind of gangster and hoodlum kind of murders that had happened in the 1950s in the UK. That created a real problem, because how could the police and the press convince the public about the potential of this man to commit crimes like this? So they used subtle techniques which would alter people's perceptions of Christie. So, for example, we have a photograph here which has been procured by the police, and this actually has been cropped, or has been shaded. Christie actually had quite a weak chin, and wouldn't normally have confirmed his physical and facial characteristics wouldn't have normally conformed with what people would expect a murderer to look like. So here, around the chin, they've strengthened his jawline.
They've shaded it
in order to give the impression of being much more lantern-jawed and give a stronger facial characteristic.
To make him look tougher?
To make him look tougher, yeah.
As if we know what murderers look like.
Well, exactly. I mean, and in fact, you know, the very fact that the Christie did remain undetected for quite a while is kind of probably down to his physical characteristics.
And what use was made of this image in the newspapers?
Having cropped and shaded the image, they then, this was, as far as we're aware, one of the earliest uses, perhaps a forerunner of Crime Watch UK, one of the earliest uses of television, the medium of television, in terms of hunting down a fugitive. They actually took the image that they doctored and put it on television within various news bulletins, looking to establish the whereabouts of who was clearly the key suspect in the case. There's an interesting photograph here, which was within the Herald, where they've taken a television set, and to demonstrate within the article the use of television in terms of aiding the police hunting for a fugitive, they've taken the photograph and stuck it onto the screen of a television set. It's quite amusing, actually, if it wasn't so serious.
And they printed this in the paper?
This was printed in the newspaper with a headline of "New Medium Assists the Police in Their Investigations."
This fantastic wooden cabinet television with the Baker-like knobs on the
Yeah,
front.
wonderful 1950s television receiver.
And John Christie stuck in the middle of the screen.
Yeah.
These are some of the victims. Ina McLennan.
Yeah, yeah.
Who else is here?
There's Ruth First. And we have here, these are all images from the Daily Herald, Rita Nelson. Many of these women worked as prostitutes within Notting Hill. Christie had a reputation for being a backstreet abortionist and would quite often befriend prostitutes and bring them back to 10 Rillington Place, where subsequently he would gas them. And again, I mean, the film is remarkably, although it doesn't go into detail in terms of how he murdered and disposed of the bodies, it does give an accurate portrayal of the kind of modus operandum that he used.
He gassed them to make them drowsy?
He would say that he was putting them under some kind of anaesthetic in order to perform the abortion. And what he would do is he would attach a pipe to a coal gas outlet with a bulldog clip on, and then he would run it through a mixture of balsam to take away the coal gas smell. And with a homemade mask, he would press it over the individual's face and ask her to breathe more deeply. And as she began to breathe in, he would take the bulldog clip off the pipe, allowing the gas to come through the balsam and literally poison the woman. Within seconds she would become drowsy, although there would have required physical force to hold the mask in place once the woman realised what was happening to her. But by then it was probably too late.
And he actually killed them by strangling?
Yeah, what he used to do is, after having gassed them, he would then strangle them to make sure they were dead and perform sex acts on the dead body. It wasn't unusual for him to retain trophies from the body, and, as was subsequently reported, they actually found a human thigh bone propping up one of the fences in the garden.
Now, how do you deal with a character like Christie? The most awful sexual pervert, but a man of such frustration and such sexual drive that he could not find any peace or satisfaction in anything other than this necrophilia. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. He was a mild, charming to a certain extent, and slightly sinister, I think. But when I talked to the detectives and the police, they didn't find him, they wouldn't have apprehended him walking down the street, you know. I acted with a great actor called Edward G. Robinson. He always said to me, Richard, no matter what you bring to the characterization of any human being that you present, however dreadful, however awful, however abhorrent that person is, you've got to find the truth in it, because unless in your eyes there is that element of absolute conviction, you will not get away with it on the screen. You will not get away with it. And so it was a strange feeling, because in Rillington Place I actually had to perform the most terrible scenes and so on. And in the knowledge that we were making that film where all those murders took place, I find it quite difficult at the end of the day to face my family. I needed time to, as it were, get rid of what I've, as an actor, had to bring to that performance. Now, all that sounds perhaps a bit fancy and so on, but it isn't in truth. Actors, we're a bit silly on a number of occasions and in the particular circumstances whereby we overplay our difficulties of performance or the stature that we've attained or not, as the case may be. But in fact, the job is a serious one. If you are wanting to bring a conviction, real conviction, in characterization, not merely searching your own persona, but bringing something quite different, you do have to bring tremendous power of concentration to what you're doing. And if there are things that you want to do, as Rillington Place, where I was and am utterly, passionately opposed to capital punishment, then there are lengths to which you will go in terms of your characterization because of the conviction of the entity in which you are involved.
It had a deliberately political...
Oh, unquestionably, unquestionably. Most of us worked for next to nothing in order to make it. And those of us who were and still are opposed to capital punishment felt that this was one thing that the movie business could do. So we set about making that movie as fast as we could in order to get it out, in order to try and give a platform for the anti-capital punishment conviction.
The idea that there could be a miscarriage of justice then was something that the British public found quite shocking.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And may have resisted.
Indeed. Oh, indeed.
When Timothy Evans stood trial for murder, it took the jury just 40 minutes to find him guilty of killing his daughter Geraldine. Of course, they knew nothing of the bodies lying in John Christie's back garden at the time of the trial, and Evans had apparently confessed to killing his wife, so all seemed very straightforward. He was a man with a violent temper, little money, and a desperate situation with another child on the way. Ludovic Kennedy again.
He didn't help himself, I'm afraid, but then he was a man of very poor intellect, and he was illiterate, you see. I mean, that was another thing about him, poor chap. He simply, all this was far too much for him. He was pitched into something way beyond his understanding, and he was vulnerable. That's why he agreed to make a confession early in the morning after the police had been going at him all night. No jury would think that a man who would, as they thought, voluntarily confess to a crime would do so unless he'd actually committed the crime. That's the trouble.
You make a strong contrast between the language in the statements, which reads like almost stereotypical police language,
yes,
and Timothy Evans' own ability with words,
yes,
or inability with
yes,
words.
Oh, there were all sorts of phrases which are only police phrases, like whilst, a sort of poetic whilst instead of while, and of no fixed abode, and things like that, which somebody like Timothy Evans couldn't possibly have dreamed up.
What do you think happened that night in Notting Hill Police Station then?
I think that the police just hammered away at him. The News Chronicle rang up the police at 3 in the morning and said, were there any further developments? And the police said, no, he's still being interviewed. And it wasn't until, in Evans's view, about 5 o'clock in the morning, that he finally broke down and agreed to a confession.
But why did he then confess in such detail which was provably wrong, to something which he hadn't done?
You see, you've got to understand in those days what the police attitude to people who they were convinced were guilty was. and it was absolute certainty in their own minds that the man that they were interviewing was guilty. Absolute certainty. They wanted to get confirmation from the suspect's own mouth that he'd done the things that they believed he'd done.
And that was what hanged him, wasn't it?
That was what hanged him. Although, if you remember, I was lucky enough to get hold of the details of his last days and weeks in prison, when he denied all knowledge of it and said that he'd been bulldozed into this. But of course nobody believed him. Why should they? He accused Christie of doing it, and they said, why should Christie, this elderly gentleman, old enough to be Evans's father, you know, why should dear old Christie, was always a sick man and always going to the doctor, why should he kill Mrs. Evans and his daughter? No reason at all.
Timothy Evans was a clumsy but congenital liar, a man prone to boasting to boost his self-esteem. John Christie was also a self-delusional liar who wanted others to think well of him. But while Evans had a mental age of 11, Christie was relatively intelligent and knew how to manipulate the gullible younger man. And the one piece of evidence that might have saved Timothy Evans was suppressed by the prosecution. Two workmen were prepared to give evidence that there were no bodies in the wash house when they were working in there, which was several days after Timothy Evans had supposedly hidden them there. These statements never came before the jury, and the defence remained ignorant of their existence. Christie was finally arrested in March 1953 and tried in June. He was found guilty and hanged on the 15th of July. Why did Christie not confess to murdering the baby? He did confess in graphic terms to the murders and sexual assaults of the women, but not the baby. Why not?
Well, he got quite near to it. He said, if there is absolute proof that I did murder the baby, I would have to admit it, but I understand there is no such proof. And so he got himself off the hook in that way. And don't forget, Christie deep down was a Puritan. He minded a lot what people thought of him. And it was quite one thing murdering a number of tarts in 10 Rillington Place, but to murder a baby, a little helpless child, was something he was not prepared to admit to, because he knew how the world would have condemned him for that.
And that wasn't a murder which he had committed for what he called the quiet, peaceful thrill that he got from those murders of the women. He killed the baby because it was inconvenient.
That's right. Killed the baby because it got it out of the way and people would stop asking awkward questions.
We have exhibits here from the Christie murder. You can see in front of you that certificate of service, because of course that John Reginald Halliday Christie during the war was a reserve police officer working out of Harrow Road. He was asked to leave after interfering with ladies in the canteen.
Inside Scotland Yard's Crime Museum, curator Alan McCormick keeps some of the material evidence relating to the Christie case.
John Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place and the house was taken over by Mr. Beresford Brown. He tried to put up a shelf to put his radio in the kitchen area. As he did so, the wall behind the shelf actually started moving. He pulled back the wallpaper and found it was a door into a pantry. Looking through a crack in the door, he could see 3 semi-naked ladies all sitting one behind the other. Police were called, a search of the house was done, and underneath the floorboards in the front room was the body of Ethel Christie, John Christie's wife. At the back of the exhibit you can see a plant root. At the base of that root you can see a vertebrae. They went to see a botanist and they said to the botanist, how long would it take for that particular root to grow that length through the vertebrae? They said, tell me the type of root, the soil type and the rainfall for that area. Putting those 3 pieces of the equation together, they established that that body had been in the ground for at least 9 years. Further search of the garden revealed those pieces of that skull there, which had been put together. There was 108 pieces put together around a mould of wax. So that established from that skull that it was a lady. Beside the body, beside the bones, was the jaw, and in that jaw you can see teeth. One of those teeth has been filled, and that filling is an amalgam of mercury and silver. Never been used in this country. They did a search of all countries to find out who used that combination, and it was established it came from Germany. Searching the records of ladies that went missing in 1943, and there was some 8,000, they found an Austrian lady who lived 2 streets away from Christie by the name of Ruth First, and that is the remains of her body.
After the execution of Christie, the legal and political establishment refused to accept that Timothy Evans had been wrongfully hanged. The official line was that 2 killers resided at 10 Rillington Place. Later, it was argued that while Timothy Evans probably didn't kill his baby, Geraldine, he did kill his wife, Beryl, the crime he'd not stood trial for. In 1966, Timothy Evans was pardoned by the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, and finally in November last year, for the first time in 54 years, 2 High Court judges made a declaration of his innocence of both crimes. There are still those who argue that he may have had a role in the murder of his wife and child, but it seems certain that Timothy Evans was an innocent man hanged in perhaps the most notorious miscarriage of justice in British legal history. The death penalty was finally abolished in the UK in 1998 and cannot be reintroduced under the European Convention of Human Rights. Ludovic Kennedy again.
A lot of MPs, Labour MPs particularly, in the House of Commons, were influenced by this book and the case to vote against the death penalty. Mark you, we were one of the last countries in the world to give it up. I think every other country in Europe, almost every other country in Europe, had already given it up.
What do you think of the film?
Well, I loved the film at the time, and I think it captured that appallingly claustrophobic atmosphere that existed in 10 Rillington Place, that awful little... I mean, I've been there. I went to 10 Rillington Place a number of times, and there was something really spooky about it, and about the cramped surroundings and the washhouse and the outside lavatory and all that where the bodies were found, which almost sort of turned one up. It's gone now, but it was a very spooky place.
Real Histories was presented by Jerry Northam and produced in Bristol by John Byrne. Next week, the people of Nuremberg remember when the Nazi Party rally came to town in 1934. But does the record of that event, Triumph of the Will, deserve its reputation as the most infamous propaganda film of the 20th century? Real Histories at the same time next week. At 5:30, Francine Stock will be talking to the director and star of the Oscar-nominated Spanish film The Sea Inside, that's based on the real-life story of a paralyzed man who fought a 30-year campaign for the right to die. The film program is at 5:30.
3 years ago, a Florida market trader placed a collection of diaries and letters for sale on an internet auction site. They turned out to be the private possessions of Malcolm X.
Give the greetings to all the believers, make friends with everyone, speak ill of no one, thank Allah for our many, many blessings. Assalamu alaikum, your tired husband, Malcolm X. You know, and after seeing all this, you just fall in love with this man.